All right, Ms. Blackman here to talk about the U.S. involvement in Cuba during the Cold War, and then also the escalation of war in Vietnam as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So, Cuba. Let's talk about Cuba first. So, here's Cuba right here, and the majority of the Cuban population was impoverished. Cuba was a major exporter of sugar to the U.S., and Cuba resented the U.S. for its economic dominance and for supporting General Batista. Batista was their brutal and cruel dictator. So in 1958, Fidel Castro started a revolution in Cuba in favor of a communist government, and he named himself president for life. So, why might a communist takeover in Cuba especially worry Americans? Well, look at where Cuba is located. It's not very far from Florida at all. So Cuba's government fell into the hands of the communist dictator Fidel Castro, and there he is right there. And Americans were alarmed that communism was so close to the U.S. This worried them for a number of reasons, especially because now that Cuba was communist, Castro was in cahoots with Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union during this time. So Castro established this communist regime in Cuba. They seized U.S. properties, and Soviet Union promises in return to provide economic and military aid to Cuba. And 10% of the Cuban population went into exile during this time, mostly to the U.S. So the Bay of Pigs. Cuban exiles and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, planned to invade and overthrow Castro in Cuba. So April 17th, 1961, the exiles supported by military land on the coast were supported by U.S. military land on the coast of the Bay of Pigs. So these are the exiles. They were kind of trained by the U.S. military. They land right here on this coast called the Bay of Pigs. Castro heard that they were coming. He knew that they would attack. Kennedy, who was president at the time, had promised to send air support to help these exiles, but he takes back that offer. He's afraid that if he sends the air support, then Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, will see that the U.S. directly aided Cuba, and then it will start this big thing between the U.S. and the USSR. And we didn't want direct conflict with the USSR. So when Kennedy doesn't send air support, and the fact that Fidel Castro knows they're coming, this is not good at all for the Cuban exiles. They are all killed or captured in this attack. The exiles reveal the U.S. backing, and Castro goes to the USSR for military and economic support. The U.S. was deeply humiliated with the Bay of Pigs, and this invasion increases support for Castro in Cuba and the Soviet Union. Okay, so the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Nikita Khrushchev decided to give Cuba his full support. He sent weapons to Cuba, including nuclear missiles. A U.S. spy plane catches sight of these nuclear missiles and sees these sites under construction, these nuclear missile sites. So why is this a big problem? Well, if you are able to see this map down here, it shows that Cuba can launch missiles to any major city in the United States during that time, and it would be a direct hit. So October 22nd, 1962, JFK is notifies the Americans of the missiles and calls for a blockade of Cuba, a naval blockade where nobody can get through. JFK warned Soviets that a missile attack will trigger war on the USSR. And the Soviets and the U.S. frantically negotiate behind the scenes. And Soviets agree to remove missiles in Cuba if Kennedy withdraws missiles from Turkey. And so he agrees to do so. Secretary of State Dean Rusk described the situation. We were eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow blinked, meaning the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis is considered one of the most dangerous events in human history, even though nothing actually happened because negotiations were made. it still could have been very, very bad. This is taking it right to the brink of nuclear war. Excuse me, sorry. All right, a new enemy emerges. So let's talk about involvement in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was leader of North Vietnam, and he led a brutal, repressive communist regime, but he was very popular with the people because he gave out a lot of land and he was seen as a national hero in North Vietnam. South Vietnam's anti-communist president, Ngo Dinh Diem, refused election, and so the U.S. supported his decision because he knew that he wasn't as popular as Ho Chi Minh. So the idea was that they would have an election and decide who was going to be in charge of Vietnam instead of it being split right here, 17th parallel. But South Vietnam's president knew that he probably wouldn't win. So the U.S. supported him in not running for election against Ho Chi Minh. Diem was corrupt, though, and he stifled opposition and restricted Buddhism in South Vietnam. So he wasn't very liked at all there. The Viet Cong was a communist group in the South that formed, and they started to kill government officials there. Ho Chi Minh sent arms to military weapons to the Viet Cong along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So Ho Chi Minh, who is the leader of North Vietnam, is helping out the Viet Cong in South Vietnam to kind of take over. South Vietnamese request help, and they receive U.S. military support in the form of training to its armed forces. So the U.S. is trying to train South Vietnamese army to defend themselves. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin. So there was an alleged attack on the U.S. Navy destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, and Lyndon B. Johnson, who was president at the time, he took over for Kennedy after Kennedy was assassinated, asked for the power to repel the enemy. Was there really an attack? We don't know. 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave the president broad military powers. It allowed Lyndon B. Johnson to send troops to Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. And so this definitely broadens the executive powers. U.S. combat troops were sent to South Vietnam to battle the Viet Cong. No longer are they just training the South Vietnamese army. They themselves are going to war to fight in South Vietnam, to fight against North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. And this leads to China and the USSR also sending troops to North Vietnam to help on the communist side. Okay, so what's the conclusion of Cuba and Vietnam? U.S. took action in both Cuba and Vietnam to contain communism. The situation in Cuba could have easily escalated to direct conflict between the USSR and the U.S., but it was averted when the Soviets backed down. The world was on the brink of yet another war, but the issue was resolved at the last minute. In Vietnam, the U.S. gradually increased its involvement in the region to contain communism. It began just as military aid to the South Vietnamese, such as military training, and then it ends up being U.S. forces engaging in combat with the communist fighters in the region. Both Presidents Kennedy and followed by Johnson made their foreign policy decisions on what they believed would be important for protecting the U.S. and for stopping the spread of communism. Thank you for watching.